this is very common that Muslim girls are forced to wear hijab. And when they get to school, they take it off and they shove it in their backpack and they live their whole school day normally. And then before they go home, they put it back on again before they're heading home. In fact, one of my friends went to the University of Toronto where she used to do that. Her father came and found her on the campus and beat her up in the middle of the quad. And he was eventually arrested. And thankfully, she was able to free herself from him.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Yasmine Mohammed. Yasmine is a human rights activist and author of Unveiled, How the West Empowers Radical Muslims. Yasmine is one of the most prominent and vocal figures supporting persecuted freethinkers across the globe, from elevating the voices of marginalized freethinkers on her podcast to creating a global network of allies across religious and political divides through the Clarity Coalition. In our conversation, Yasmine shares how her childhood was dramatically changed when her mother became an unofficial second wife to a devout Muslim man, and how Canada failed to protect her due to the bigotry of low expectations. She describes her journey from non-practicing Muslim to becoming an open atheist, and how the trauma of her childhood continued to haunt her as an adult. We also discuss how countries suffer under Islamic rule, the particular hatred of Jews that is a core element of Islam, and the origin of and problems with the term Islamophobia. It is my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Yasmine Mohammed. Yasmine Mohammed, I'm very happy to have you on Podcast for Inquiry today.
Thank you so much for having me, Leslie. It's my pleasure and honor.
I feel like this is, in a way, long overdue. I was scheduled to meet you 5 years ago when the Centre for Inquiry Canada was organizing the book launch tour across Canada for Unveiled. And unfortunately, that was to begin in March of 2020. And we had to make the correct but the difficult decision to cancel your tour at the last minute. So here we are, half a decade later. I'm finally getting the chance to speak with you, and it's long overdue, but welcome. And this is something I've been looking forward to for some time. I wanted to say that I've read your book, and I was in turns shocked and horrified throughout most of it. It's open, it's raw, and I particularly for the opening, 50 or 100 pages, I kept thinking to myself, how could this be happening in Canada? And I'd like, maybe you can start by describing what your life was like in the early years, and where you were living, and just describe to our listeners what you experienced as a young girl.
Mm-hmm. So I was born and raised in Vancouver initially, and then, all around the sort of that kind of area, right? The whole Lower Mainland. So Vancouver, Surrey, Richmond, White Rock, but when I was very little, so I was born in Vancouver General Hospital. So when I was very little, I was in Vancouver. And my parents were kind of separating at the time when I was born. So my mom is from Cairo, Egypt, and my dad is from Gaza. And they met in university in Egypt because at the time Gaza was under Egyptian leadership, and Gazan people were allowed to go to university for free in Egypt. So my dad took the opportunity because university is free for all Egyptians. And so they extended that to Gazans as well. And they met, they got married, they moved down to San Francisco, had my sister. It was too much peace, love, and hippie era going on. This was like late 60s, early 70s. Um, and then they decided, well, my mom decided that they needed to move to somewhere quieter. And with my dad being Palestinian, he could go anywhere because he was considered a refugee. So he could go anywhere in the world he wanted. So he applied for Australia and Canada. And then they decided they would just go to Vancouver because it's just so close to San Francisco. And then my brother was born. And then finally I was born. And they weren't together for very long. When their relationship fell apart, my dad moved to Montreal. And at that point, my mom was left alone in Vancouver with 3 kids. And she didn't really have a community. She didn't have friends. She didn't have a support group. She didn't really know that many people there. And so she went to the local mosque, really just looking for other Arabic speaking women that she could be friends with or something like that, because she's like in a new country, single mom. She's just looking for connection.
Right. That makes
But
sense.
yeah, she was not religious at all. She did not grow up religious, never wore hijab. Religion was never part of it. In fact, religion was like laughed at by people who were from the cities, like from Cairo and Alexandria and the bigger cities, because it was considered like for the villagers, for the uneducated. And my mom grew up like going to, um, Christian schools and having Christian friends. Like she didn't have any of the stuff that she later developed, which was this hatred towards anyone that was not Muslim. But so when she walked into the mosque that day looking for friendship and community, she ended up meeting a man, an Egyptian man who was already married, already had 3 kids. But he kind of wooed my mom to take her on as his second wife. So men in Islam can marry up to 4 women concurrently. And
Yeah,
yeah,
so I've heard of that, but this was in Vancouver at the time, right?
that's
And
correct.
and bigamy is not permissible in Canada. Like you can't have 2 wives. So was your mom like agreeing to be a mistress, or was it unofficial? Like how did it? Help me understand what that arrangement was like.
Yeah, exactly that. So his first wife was his legal wife.
Mm-hmm.
And so she would have had all the rights that a wife has. And my mom was just, yeah, she was just the side chick. She's technically Islamically married to him, but that she had zero rights as a wife, right? Um, we it was we were having very different experiences. We being me and my brother and my sister versus my mom. So we, as kids, up until this man entered our lives, everything was perfectly normal. We played with our non Muslim friends, we went swimming, rode our bikes, had birthdays, listened to music, like just like lived like average Canadian kids. I
Right.
didn't even notice a difference between me and my friends.
Mm-hmm.
When he entered our lives, suddenly it was like everything is haram, everything is forbidden. So he would break my mom's records and he'd say music is from the devil. He didn't allow us to have birthday parties anymore because you don't celebrate anything other than Allah, right? You don't no longer allowed to have non-Muslim friends because they're dirty. And everything was like you're not allowed. You're not allowed to go. As a girl, I wasn't allowed to go swimming anymore because that's showing too much skin. I wasn't allowed to ride a bicycle anymore because I could lose my virginity on a bicycle.
Oh my goodness. Right. Okay.
Yeah. So
Because virginity is defined as the hymen, uh,
yes,
an
well, and
intact hymen.
it is the be all and the end all. So in my book, I describe it as like the tamper proof seal on a vitamin bottle. Really, that's how they see it. Like it's so important this that girls can't ride bicycles, they can't ride horses, there's all sorts of restrictions on playing sports. It's all about thinking that this hymen is just good. If it breaks, then oh my god, then you'll just be like garbage, used garbage that we're never gonna be able to marry you off.
Right. It's like that. There's the difference between a new car and a used car, and a used car is always worth less. But then people are taking that
Yeah.
and applying that to people, to girls and women, and that without an intact hymen, your value as a human being is substantially reduced.
Exactly. Yeah. And so for my mom, she thought this was, she was, I guess, really caught up. She just became a religious zealot at this time. She's what I called her a born again Muslim. She got really, really caught up in this political Islam that this man was selling, which is this idea of like pro Islam, anti West, super intertwined.
And
Pro
this
Islam,
was,
anti
and
West.
how long had this man been living in Canada? Like it always, I mean, I was born and raised in Canada. I've traveled to a few places. No country is perfect, and Canada is no exception. There's been a lot of things that this country has done that I disapprove of. Whether we're talking municipally, provincially, or federally, there's decisions made by the various levels of government that I disagree with, sometimes passionately. But overall, I think Canada is a great country. When compared with, especially when you look at all the other countries in the world, there are others that are also good, but Canada overall is a great country. And one of the reasons that I'm part of CFIC is that it can be better. I want it to be better, and that's why I do the activism and the work that I'm doing. For this, I don't know if I should call him your stepfather, but this man who your mother was seeing, how long had he been here that he had not? It's justifiable to criticize the West, or pointing out that it has flaws, because that, of course, is true and legitimate. But this hatred that you speak of and write of, where does that come from? How does he reconcile it from his direct experiences? And can you provide some insight into what his mindset was to have that view?
Yeah. Well, first, I should say it's not just his mindset. This is a very, very common mindset. And it really just stems from the us and them mentality, the in group versus out group. The Muslims are good. They're going to go to heaven. They are this earth is for them.
Mm-hmm.
Non-Muslims are filthy, dirty, going to burn in hell. So there's just like this very strict dichotomy. And so it just stems from that. And the he was living in Toronto before he moved to Vancouver, where he met my mom. And in Toronto he had 3 kids, so he was there for long enough.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up marrying a French Canadian woman from Quebec who converted to Islam. So he'd been there for quite a long time. And when I don't know exactly how long he'd been in Canada, but he'd been in Canada for a very long time.
Okay.
But this disdain for the country that you're living in, that's very common. And my mom had it very much as well. And the imams in the mosques and the teachers in the Islamic school. And it was just like, that's such a common refrain in the community. And it's not just in Canada. You hear the same thing, whether you're in the UK or Sweden or France or Germany. It's the same stories over and over and over again. On my podcast, I'm bringing in a lot of people that have grown up in the West and who have had very similar experiences to mine. And you'll hear this over and over and over again. This woman I had on my podcast from the UK was telling me about how her grandmother sat her down and was crying and was telling her, I never want you to have British friends. Please don't ever make friends with these people. If you ever make friends with them, you're going to break my heart. And she loved her grandmother, so she always felt like she could never be friends with these Brits. She's living in Britain, and she's not supposed to have friends with British friends. Yeah.
Well, we'll provide a link to your podcast in the show notes so that people can listen and subscribe.
Yeah. So that was my sort of shock in my life. We went from living normally, and then my mom introduces this man to us, and suddenly everything changes.
Mm-hmm.
Her first and foremost, she started to change so much. Started to put hijab on, started to be really strict about prayers and Quran, like memorizing Quran, and so many rules. And then we started going to an Islamic school that was in Richmond, BC. Um, Hijab was put on me, obviously, and it was just like all downhill from the moment he entered our lives.
Yes, one of the things that and it wasn't just the restrictions on your social activities. There was a lot of I guess there's no other way to put it than there was a lot of abuse in that household as well. Um, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but can you talk a bit about, in addition to these social restrictions, the inability to listen to music, to choose your own friends, to participate in life with your peers. But it wasn't as though you were just cut off from the outside world, but the life within your home was reasonably safe and happy. Can you provide a little bit of insight into what life was like within the four walls of your apartment,
Yeah.
with this man in your family's life?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, he was extremely abusive. He was physically abusive. In my book, I recount many instances of that. Um, there was the one of the worst situations that happened to me was when he saw that I had written my name as Jasmine instead of Yasmin in a book, and like in my one of my notebooks. And then he took that as like this sign that I was trying to be Canadian, I was trying to be Western, and that I was, that they were losing me to the country that I was born and raised in and living in. And so, in order to make a big, huge kind of, impact on me, he hung me upside down in the garage and was whipping me.
Oh my God.
And that's one of the many stories, one of the many experiences that I shared with my teacher, Mr. Fabro, who wrote the foreword for my book. Um, I showed him all the bruises, I showed him all the welts, I spoke to him about everything that was going on. He alerted the police, who alerted child services, and there was this huge, investigation that went on for so long because they needed to talk to all of us three, plus this man's children as well. And in the end, the judge said, "It's your culture. It's the way your family chooses to discipline you. So who am I to intervene?"
That for me was one of the most shocking aspects of your book. I have to acknowledge that there are violent and terrible individuals in the world, but I try to place my trust in institutions, and I just want to quote one sentence of your book that this pertains to. You write, "The judge ruled that corporal punishment wasn't against the law in Canada, and due to our culture, sometimes those punishments can be more severe than in the average Canadian household," which just strikes me as the bigotry of low expectations, which is every bit as racist or prejudiced as saying that they're incapable. I mean, essentially, that's saying we can't expect a Muslim man to behave in a reasonable manner, and so beating his daughter or stepdaughter, not officially, not even either of those, is something that we can tolerate. And that was the official position of a Canadian judge in our lifetimes. I mean, I'm assuming you and I are roughly the same age. That it was utterly shocking. I'm wondering, was this ruling an anomaly, or was that sort of the pervasive attitude in Canada at the time? And has anything changed in the intervening decades?
I wish I could tell you that things have changed, but in fact, things have gotten worse. So this cultural relativism idea has become even more pervasive. This term Islamophobia didn't even exist in the 90s when this happened to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is like things have really escalated. I was speaking to a young Syrian girl, 14 years old, in Toronto, who her father had punched her in the face and broke her nose because he saw that she was texting with a boy. And same thing. She wasn't taken out of the home. The mother was defending the father and saying, this is just in our culture. He just got very angry. Um, and yeah, she wasn't protected. The stories are endless, and it's not just in my province of BC. These are unfortunately provinces across Canada. And it's not just Canada either. Again, I could tell you stories from the UK. I could tell you stories from Australia. I could tell you stories from the US, So this idea that we have to coddle people's cultures, regardless of how violent or vicious or misogynist those cultures are, that's really the most insidious idea. That's the thing that is causing us to defend and protect these institutions, these ideologies, versus the victims. The people who are victims of these ideologies.
Yeah, Islamophobia is a tricky term because anti-Muslim bias, like prejudice against Muslims, simply for being Muslims, is a real thing, and it's tied up with racism, although they're not the same thing because a majority, though not all, Muslims have darker skin of one shade or another, and to claim that there is no such thing as prejudice or bias or hatred against Muslims simply for being Muslim would be false. On the other hand, and so if Islamophobia was a synonym for hatred or prejudice against Muslims, then it would be fine because it's a real thing and it needs to be addressed. It's a genuine issue in society, and in Canada as well. But on the other hand, Islam is a religion that is an idea that is open to critique. Some people, over 1 billion people believe in it, and okay, that's fine. Over 1 billion people, well over 2 billion people believe in some version of Christianity. Also, Hinduism, Judaism, and Buddhism, and Wiccan, and so on. And all of these ideas, just like all these religious ideas or ideologies, just like political and economic ones, are open to criticism, and some of those critiques may be founded and some of them might be invalid, but you should be able to, we have to be able to critique those ideas. But any critique of Islam, not Muslims, but of Islam, is far too often then turned around and the person critiquing the religion is accused of Islamophobia, which again is a terrible name because it's not an irrational fear of Islam. It's whether it's you're critiquing the religion or whether it's a bias against Muslims, but it's the word that is common parlance. And those two very different ideas are conflated into one, which makes Islamophobia a very slippery and a very slippery term. Where do you stand on the word Islamophobia, and how do we fight against prejudice or hatred of Muslims while preserving the right, and in some cases, a social duty to at least have the right to critique Islam?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with everything that you said. And in fact, the term Islamophobia was created by Islamists. So those are political Muslims. So people like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic regime of Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, like Al Qaeda. This is to give you an idea of the kinds of people I'm referring to when I say Islamists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they are the ones who came up with this term. In fact, it was in Iran where they came up with the term. And they chose a term that kind of sounded like xenophobia, homophobia. They wanted it to sound like a progressive word because they wanted progressives to use it as a bludgeon to silence criticism of Islam. And it's exactly what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
It worked perfectly. And Iranians are professionals at this because they've used the left as useful idiots before. It's the whole reason why the Islamic regime of Iran even has power today, is because of the communists and socialists and everybody on the left who thought that they would ally with them, because they have, again, that pro-West, or sorry, pro-Islam, anti-West ideology of Islamists. You'll find people on the left, they really agree with the anti-West side of things. So they think, oh, we can be allies, we'll work together to dismantle this system. But what they don't realize is that they are useful idiots. And once they are not useful anymore, they are going to be thrown away. And in fact, what happened in Iran is they were literally imprisoned and killed and tortured. That's how they were thrown away. They were no longer useful anymore once the regime took power in Iran. So they came up with this term Islamophobia essentially because they had tried many, many times in the UN to make these to make it illegal, to make these blasphemy laws against criticizing Islam. And of course, that was never going to fly. It was the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperative, which are the largest non-government organization other than the UN. And they really were trying to pass this, and it wasn't successful. And so they decided, okay, plan B, instead of doing top-down blasphemy laws, top-down the way they do in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, everywhere else, which means you're going to go to prison, you're going to be killed, you're going to be lashed, we're not able to do that in Western countries. We can't do top-down. So they decided, okay, you know what, guys, we're going to do bottom-up. So they came up with this term Islamophobia. They hoped that it would become pervasive and start to get used by people who thought that they were doing good. These are the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? These are people that think they're doing a good thing by silencing criticism. But what are they silencing criticism of? You're silencing criticism of women who are speaking up against being imprisoned over hijab. You're silencing criticism over people speaking up against child marriage or against homosexuals being killed, or against women being beaten by their husbands or raped by their husbands. These are the things that you're stopping us from criticizing. So they don't think it through too much, right? They just start to use this term thinking it's making them a good person. They silence me and other people who are victims of Islam, survivors of Islam. We call it Islamotrauma, is what we call it. We're like, there's no Islamophobia, it's Islamotrauma. But having said all that, you're absolutely correct. There's a very big difference between Muslims as individuals and Islam as a doctrine. Islam as a doctrine, have at it. Go for it. Criticize it till the cows come home. It's not a sacred cow. There's no such thing. Go ahead. Criticize it all you want, and it is very deserving of a lot of criticism. There's a lot of things in there to criticize. You're never going to get bored, right? You're never going to run out.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. But when it comes to individual Muslim people, and you were talking it's almost 2 billion people, that's a huge spectrum. That's a spectrum from people like, Asr Nomani or Zudi Jasser or, just like average Muslim people who believe in secularism, who believe in democracy, who love the West and love their neighbors, and all the way to like ISIS on the other side of that spectrum, right? So Muslims can fit anywhere in there.
With 2 billion with 1.5 or a little over 1.5 billion people, you're going to have, of course, a huge variety of types of people in that category.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, just look at your mother, how she started out and where she ended up. What a journey that was.
Exactly. She started here and made it all the way there. But yeah, so we have to be careful that obviously when we're criticizing Islam, that obviously we're not speaking about all Muslims. Obviously we're not criticizing, we're not attacking Muslim people. We're criticizing the religion that to be perfectly honest, and everybody knows this, Muslims are the first victims of Islam.
Yes.
Muslim women are the first victims of Islam. Muslim homosexuals are the first victims of Islam. You know, the terrorism that these Islamic groups engage in, Muslims are the first victims of this, right? You know, when ISIS took hold, who did they kill first? Shia Muslims, right? This
Yeah.
is what they do.
And that was something I wanted to ask about before, and thank you for bringing that up. You mentioned that in your household when you were growing up, according to this man that your mother got close with, that the major dividing line was between Muslims, us, and everybody else, them, and we had to keep them at bay. We had to minimize Yasmine's interactions with them so that you can be part of us and good and pure. Yeah. But the internecine violence within Muslims, and in particularly between Sunni and Shia, although those aren't the only fault lines, but the amount of violence within Islam and between Muslims is enormous and far greater than the very real and very problematic violence between, perpetrated by Muslims on non-Muslims and from non-Muslims perpetrated on Muslims itself. So something I didn't get from your book, and that I would like to ask you is, how does this mentality, someone who believes that we Muslims are good and right and pure and the rest of the world is evil, how do they justify the enormous violence that Muslims perpetrate upon other Muslims? Sometimes it's, often women, often the homosexual community, and even more often, I think, those that belong to a different branch of Islam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's the joke of the ummah. Ummah means the Muslim community, right? So mm-hmm. It's always portrayed as this big monolith that the whole ummah is super supportive of each other, and the ummah is so powerful. But the truth is, it's not. It's completely fractured, and I'm grateful for that. I'm happy to see that they are not united, because that is, that would be very bad news for the rest of the world. But you'll see, when you see things like the way Iran funded Hamas in October 7th, in that massacre of October 7th, what you're seeing there is a Shia paying Sunnis to kill Jews. And so there's a saying in Arabic that says, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my brother and my cousin against the world.
Yes. I know. I remember and actually that resonates with me. Like when I was, I'm not a Muslim, but I remember when I was, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years old, I was having a fight with my brother, and we were, throwing punches at each other, as young boys sometimes do, and someone came in to intervene to split us up, and instantly the two of us turned on this guy and started beating up on him because he was interfering in this brother fight, and then once he was out of the way, we went back to fighting, my brother and I. Right. Right. I can understand, like that's an expression that actually I can understand where that comes from.
Yeah. So what the idea there is that Muslims will always unite against non-Muslims, against Jews, against non-believers. They will always unite. Doesn't matter what flavor of Muslim they are. They will unite when it comes against the quote unquote enemy. Okay. But within themselves, they're also fractured and they're also fighting, but they will put that to the back burner within a heartbeat when it comes to fighting against non-Muslims.
Okay. I want to quote another passage from your book because it surprised me when I read it, and it's related to what you just said. You write, "The most hated of all are the Jewish people. This cannot be overstated. The hatred for Jews in Islam is very clear, very deep, and unrelenting." Now, that anti-Semitism exists, that again, very true. Not a great name, but fine, we'll just say it. We'll just use it. But why are the Jews the most hated of all? Like, you gave a long list a moment ago of, of different versions of outsiders, but Jews are top of the list. And I wasn't aware of that. That was surprising. It was disturbing. And I'm hoping you can share, why that is.
Yeah. So the Quran is full of edicts that are telling Muslim people that they need to hate Jews. And you get told it in a way like you must hate what Allah hates and you must love what Allah loves. So don't look into this too deeply. But pretty much you got to hate these guys, right? But through the stories, we can see things like the Jewish people did not. They did not convert to Islam the way Muhammad wanted them to. They did not pander and kowtow when he was threatening to, rape and pillage and murder them. They would still fight back. And so, there's one very famous story is that of Khaybar, which is a very large, I think it was like 700 or 800, a tribe of Jewish people, and he murdered all the men, took all the boys as to be raised as Muslim soldiers, and took all the girls and all the women as sex slaves. And it was like this. They still speak of it to this day. When you see the Al-Quds rallies, when you saw Hamas on the day of the ceasefire, they're screaming about Khaybar, Khaybar, the glory of Muhammad, the power of Muhammad. This will all return. So they're basically calling for the genocide of Jewish people. So there's all sorts of ideas as to why he had such hate for
I
Jewish
mean,
people.
Christianity was roughly 5 centuries old at that time. Also fought back. Yeah. So, what are some of the theories? Please continue. I'm trying to understand why Jew hatred is given such prominence in the scriptures
Well,
of
it was
Islam.
different with if when you think of how Muslim or how Jews and Christians were ethnically cleansed from the Middle East, they have very different stories, right? So you don't really there's a lot of Christians in Palestine. What Brazil is like mostly all Palestinian Christians and Lebanese Christians. Like they just left under the Ottoman Empire when they got treated as dhimmis, which are second class citizens that would have to pay a specific tax just for the fact that they're not Muslim. Um, and there's all sorts of other demeaning ways of treating them because they weren't Muslim living on Muslim land. That's how they were treated. You are not Muslim living on Muslim land, so you are interlopers here, even though if they'd been there before Islam even existed. But Christianity or Christian people had a different, how can I say this? Like they didn't offend Muhammad quite as much because they just left, or they would make treaties, peace treaties or something. But the Jewish people at the time in Arabia, they were powerful. When you looked at who were the largest traders, who were the biggest tribes, it was Jewish people. And so they weren't going to they weren't going to bow down to this new warlord. And so that really really bothered him. And Islam sees Jewish people, it's specifically in the Quran, it talks about them as being apes and pigs and less than humans. There's lots of dehumanizing language about Jewish people that same language isn't there when it comes to Christians. When it comes to Zoroastrians and Hindus and other polytheists,
Mm-hmm.
Islam just says they should be killed.
Oh, is that all?
They got to just be killed. But when it comes to Christians and Jews, because they're following the similar, it's part of the trilogy of the Abrahamic religions.
Right. Yes, and the
And
Sacred Scrolls trilogies.
yeah. So they're given like the respect of being treated as secondhand or second class citizens, and yeah, and of course, the Jewish people had the audacity to not accept to be treated as lesser than. So
Mhm.
that I think, who knows, these are just my opinions, these are just
Right.
my musings, but like I said, the Quran just says all of these horrible things about the Jews, and then it says you must hate what Allah hates and you must love what Allah loves. So people don't really question it that much. And again, they were ethnically cleansed from the Middle East, right? So most people who hate Jewish people so viciously have never met a Jewish person in their life. So it's
Right.
really, really easy to get someone to hate people when they've never met them. They don't know anything about them other than the stories that they're told.
Yeah, I read Ali Rizvi's The Atheist Muslim, and he recounts, although he thought himself to be, you know, educated and without prejudice, and he recounts the first time he was talking with someone, and then at some point in the conversation, he learned that they were Jewish, and it was the first time he'd met a Jewish person. He'd come to Canada after being born and raised in Pakistan, and he had this whole almost not a panic reaction is overstating it, but all of a sudden all the alarm bells went off in his head, and he realized that's because he had been told since he was a young boy about the Jews, and then all of a sudden that gets internalized, even though he wasn't consciously aware of that. He's obviously gotten well past that in the time since. But I thought that was quite an interesting anecdote that he shared in his book.
Yeah.
One of the things you wrote, and that I'm hoping you can expand upon, is you write that dozens of countries lost their cultures to Islam, and we talk about like Islamic culture, and we talk about Muslims, and even the judge. You know, we were earlier saying that, you know, as part of the Islamic culture or Muslim culture, we have to forgive some transgressions that we might not otherwise look the other way on. So it was a little bit jarring, although when I read that phrase, dozens of countries lost their cultures to Islam. Can you expand on that for me, please, and for our
Mhm.
audience?
Yeah. So when you think of a Catholic person in Italy or in Mexico or, in Brazil or wherever else in the world, you know that these people have different foods, different languages, different traditions, different holidays, different cultures. You can tell the difference between them, right? So even though Christianity sort of was proselytized and spread into these countries, it did not erase the cultures that existed there before. Whereas this idea of the Ummah that I was referring to before, which is this big monolith of Islam, the idea is that all countries become morphed into this monolith of Islam. So look at Egypt. Look, you're familiar with ancient Egyptian civilization, right? So when you think of that versus now, Egypt is indistinguishable, and it's North Africa, but they speak Arabic, they eat Arabic food, they consider themselves Arab. You can't, it's everything is mixed, whether you're Iraqi, whether you're Syrian, whether you're Lebanese, whether you're Egyptian, whether you're Moroccan, whether you're Algerian. Everybody's under this monolith of Muslim, and people can't even tell the difference anymore. Like Somali people think that they're Arabs, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, like these people they've all become under this big umbrella of Islam. And what happens in countries like in Malaysia and Indonesia right now, what's happening is if you wear your traditional clothes or if you name your children traditional names or something, then that's considered almost like heretic. Like, oh gosh, why are you doing that? You have to use a Muslim name. You have to dress in a Muslim way. And so it's like it is not happy to just have these people convert to Islam, but it requires that everybody just joins this huge melting pot and then becomes part of this monolith of Muslim. And this is why people can't tell the difference between Pakistanis and Iranians and Arabs. People think that they're all the same people.
So how does let's dive into this a little bit more. How does that differ from Christianity, the other largest faith in the world? Like, you can travel around the world and find, let's say, a Roman Catholic church, and you'll see this symbology. That's the same. The services might be in another language, but you recognize the tunes and the procedures. You can find a like community, and certainly where Christianity spread, it did change the culture. Certainly, you mentioned Brazil. Brazilian culture is much different today for the result of being Christian than it had been before.
I didn't say. I'm sorry if I said it didn't change it. I said it didn't erase it.
Okay, so sure. all right. So that's the distinction actually that I want to get into is what is the difference between Christianity changing the culture and the countries in which it spread, and the eradication of culture when Islam spreads into a region, into a nation?
So first of all, let me say I'm not a fan of colonization, of religious colonization. I'm not a fan of Christianity spreading across the globe and forcing native people to pray to Jesus.
Right.
And I'm certainly not a fan of Islam traveling across the globe.
Both faiths spread primarily through violent means and coercive means, and not just proselytization and convincing people through words. That happens, correct, but that's not the majority of that's not the dominant way in which Christianity and Islam have spread across the world.
No, but now when you look at these countries, let's take the most obvious example, which is the hijab.
Okay.
Now all Muslim women look the same across the globe. They used to have their individual clothings and their individual ways of dressing, and now everybody is just in hijab or niqab. So that's one example of it. Another example of it is the language, Arabic. You must read the Quran in Arabic and recite the Quran in Arabic, and all of your 5 daily prayers must be in Arabic. Allah only speaks Arabic. If you want to speak to Allah, it has to be in Arabic.
Okay.
And so that forces people, again, across the globe, that Arabic is not their language, but they must learn it because they are Muslim now. And so Iranians are now learning Arabic, Pakistanis are now learning Arabic, Indonesians are now learning Arabic. Do you see what I'm saying? So when everybody looks the same and everybody sounds the same, now we have an erasure of cultures.
Okay. Thank you. I want to sort of bring this back to your journey, because everything we've been talking, not when we're talking about the globe and politics and culture, these are of course very important. But at heart, the reason that I think this is important to you is that this has very real impacts and lasting impacts on people, on individuals, and the suffering is huge. And one of the points, I had to stop reading for a bit and collect myself, because I'm going to quote again a small passage from your book, because I was on the verge of tears, and I feared I would break down if I continued reading. And that was a bit later on in your life. I was so afraid of having sex with a man I wasn't married to that I would imagine I was actually with a man who I didn't want to be with in order to get through it. So can you describe the context in which you experienced that, and sort of explain why that was, in a sense, preferable for you?
So, indoctrination is not just in your brain, it's throughout your entire body, it's throughout your entire nervous system. And so, many, many, many times in my life, I have been indoctrinated to believe one thing, and then, like, logically, like my prefrontal cortex is telling me this is not correct, this is not right, I do not agree with this anymore. But still, your lizard brain is like, no, fear it, it's horrible, it's terrible, and so the two parts of your brain are like in this war. And you have to, in order to cleanse the indoctrination from your mind and from your body, you have to push past it. You have to push through it, actually. The only way past it is through it. And so this was another, one of those examples where I knew that um, I wanted to be with this man, and that I wanted to make my own decisions and make my own choices, and to live my life the way I wanted to live it. But still, I was filled with fear. I was terrified that I was going to burn in hell, that I was breaking all of the laws of Islam, even though I didn't even consider myself a Muslim anymore. But it's not a light switch, it's a very slow and difficult process. And yeah, so that was one of those examples where I had been forced into a marriage with a terrorist, but he was my husband.
Mm-hmm.
And so Islamically, it was okay. I'm supposed to have sex with him. I am his property. In fact, I don't have the right to say no to him, you know? And so that was like the safe person, even though he was a terrorist and you know, he would rape me, but that was safe. That was allowed because that was Islamically sanctioned. Yeah. Whereas my, white Canadian boyfriend that I wanted to sleep with was forbidden, was you're going to burn in hell if you let this man touch you. And so I was stuck in between, uh, you know, wanting to go towards my freedom, but of course being completely filled with all of the sludge of indoctrination that is filling my body and my mind.
I'm I'm so sorry for what you had to endure, and I'm hoping that through your work and our work, that fewer people and eventually nobody will have to have a similar experience. Um, I've got two more questions for you. Uh, Again, I'd like you just to talk a little bit about your journey. You talked earlier about your mother, who went from essentially a secular life in Cairo, Egypt's largest city, to becoming a fairly radical fundamentalist Islamist in Vancouver. You describe, again, I'm going to quote you. First, I was a non-practicing Muslim. Then I didn't believe in any organized religion. Then I was spiritual but not religious. Then I was agnostic, and finally, I identified as atheist. Can you provide a little bit more detail on your personal journey?
Yeah. So I think it's back to what I was saying about like the sludge, basically. You have to clean it out slowly and carefully, and it's a very isolating and terrifying process. And we now have the term religious trauma that we talk about, which is the whole reason for my organization, Free Hearts, Free Minds. It supports people with religious trauma, people who grew up in Muslim communities. Um, I had to go through that entirely all on my own. And so I was just stabbing in the dark. I was just working slowly through it. I had a daughter, so that pushed me in so many ways to progress faster sometimes um, than I was ready for. You know what I mean? Like I knew I had to be a role model for her, I knew I wanted her to see the I wanted her to see me as a role model. So I needed to be that woman immediately, even though I mentally wasn't ready to be her yet, but I had to play the part. Um, and so, yeah, there was a lot of points in that journey when I would think that, I had healed or I had gotten past things or something, and then all of a sudden you see your daughter coming down the stairs in a tight top or short shorts, and all of the feelings come up of like, oh my God, she looks like a whore. And then your mouth says, you look beautiful, sweetheart. So it's like you just don't realize like how deeply these things have like just like glommed into your brain and your body too, right? Like just like viruses filling you up. And so as soon as you discover those, you know, parasites in your body and mind, then you can remove them. But it took years and years and years of discovering each one of these parasites that was just hanging around, because when you're a Muslim, you don't there's no opportunity for thinking. There's no opportunity for making choices. You're told what to wear, you're told what to do all day long, you're told how to drink your water and cut your nails and go to the bathroom. Like there's no opportunities for you to make any kinds of decisions for yourself whatsoever. So when you leave Islam, you're starting from absolute scratch. You're not rebuilding yourself, you're building yourself. And so that is a very, very slow and difficult process. And along the way, you don't that's when you start to discover all
Mm-hmm.
of these parts that were like remnant from the old you. And so that's why it took so long.
Right. Like if you think of yourself as a Muslim, like that is a core piece of your identity. And because I'm a Muslim, I follow all of these rules and traditions, and uh, I do what I need to do. And then through life, through education, through critical thinking, through experience, you realize you're not a believer anymore, and you don't consider yourself a Muslim anymore. Well, then what's left? And that's a huge void that needs to be filled, and that is challenging, painstaking work, and I
Yeah.
respect you for that. As I do, like everyone that goes through that has got to be among the most challenging things a person can undertake. All right, I have one more question for you, and thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. As you might be aware, Quebec a few years ago passed what was called Bill 21, that, among other things, bans the public display of ostentatious religious symbols for provincial employees. This has the largest impact, not only, but the largest impact on Muslim women who want to wear the hijab, who are teachers, so female teachers. This was challenged in court, and in January 2025, the Supreme Court of Canada has announced that they are going to hear the case. Now, when it's going to be heard, that will probably be sometime in 2026, and who knows when the decision will come down, maybe later next year or in 2027. No issue has split the secular community in Canada that I'm aware of, like the hijab. And you have some secular organizations that say, we don't like the hijab, this is great, we keep state and church, or state and mosque, separate. And if there's a criticism of the bill, it's that it doesn't go far enough. And then there are other secularist organizations that say government should be neutral in matters of religion. The hijab is fancy headgear. It doesn't doesn't impact their ability to communicate with their students, and that this is an invalid suppression of religion by the state, and this law should not be supported. And I'm curious where you fall on that. If you were to argue before the Supreme Court, what would your argument be on Quebec's Bill 21?
So we're speaking today on the 31st of January. Tomorrow is No Hijab Day, a day that I deemed a day to fight against this idea that a Muslim woman is only valid if she's wearing hijab, and to support women who are fighting against hijab,
And
specifically
I
women
think
like
I don't think there's any secularists that would disagree with that. Like even those
yeah,
even those that are against Bill 21 are not necessarily in favor of or support the hijab, but you have the
yeah.
right to be a Muslim. You have the right to wear the hijab, even if you disagree with Islam or the hijab.
Yeah, but it's really important for, ignorant statements like it's just fancy headgear. It's important for those kinds of statements to be, unpacked.
Okay,
So it
please
is
do.
not just fancy headgear. This is a symbol, it's a symbol of an ideology. So, same thing when you see a Jewish conservative or a Jewish Orthodox or Hasidic person when they're wearing their Jewish clothing of the furry hat or whatever it is, or if you see somebody who is Baptist and they're dressed in a certain way, or somebody's got a big crucifix on or whatever. These are all symbols of their ideology. They're all telling you who they are and what they believe.
Mhm.
And so, when you have for someone to ignorantly call that just fancy headgear or to equate it to any other scarf that anybody could wear on their head is just a lie, and they must know that it's a lie. It's not just fancy headgear. This is a symbol of an ideology. Okay, and it's a symbol that gets women killed. It's a symbol that gets women imprisoned. It's a tool of misogyny. And when you have a child in a classroom, so if you're a little kid, you're in the high school in Quebec and you're gay, and you've got this teacher and she's got a hijab on, and that Islam calls for the execution of gay people by being thrown off of a roof and then to be stoned once you reach the ground just to make sure that you're fully dead. How would that child feel? How would a child like me feel? There are so many girls who I've spoken to, and this is very common that Muslim girls are forced to wear hijab, and when they get to school, they take it off and they shove it in their backpack and they live their whole school day normally. And then before they go home, they put it back on again before they're heading home. In fact, one of my friends went to the University of Toronto where she used to do that. Her father came and found her on the campus and beat her up in the middle of the quad. And he was eventually arrested. And thankfully, she was able to free herself from him. But this is something that she was even doing at university age. So, how would that girl feel knowing that this is somebody who, and it does happen too, they pull these girls to the side and they tell them how shameful they are and how they're bringing dishonor to their families because they're taking off their hijab and blah, blah, blah. So, it is the whole purpose of secularism is freedom for everyone. And I absolutely love and support the French way of treating secularism versus the American and Canadian way. Because what happens in America is they're saying, sure, separation of church and state, but the church can still infringe on our policies and in our government and in the public sphere and in our education. But what happens with the French is they say, absolutely none of your religions. There's no, preferred religion like there is in America. All the rest of you
Mhm.
can't, but we can, right?
Right.
And even in Canada, we're still under the Church of England, right? We do not have the pure secularism that they have in France. And Quebec is following that same, with them being French Canada, they're following that same idea of pure secularism, which means this is the red line right here. When it comes to public policy, when it comes to education, when it comes to government, when it comes to anything, all of your religions need to stay in your mosques or in your synagogues or in your churches or in your homes. None of that stuff is entering out here. And I 100% agree with it. And I think it's the only way that everybody can feel safe, everybody can feel protected, especially children.
Well, Yasmin, Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for writing Unveiled. Thank you for your activism on Free Hearts, Free Minds. Thank you for your podcast. I'll put links to all of these in the show notes. This has been a wonderful conversation. Any last thoughts you have for our audience today?
Just wanted to say thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited here. And if there are people who are feeling like, in Canada, we've had a huge surge of anti-Semitism that is obviously, concerning. And we have a lot of the perpetrators of these anti-Semitic attacks are Islamists, so are these political Muslims that I was referring to before. So I am co-founder and co-director of a group called the Clarity Coalition, which is Muslims, ex-Muslims, Christians, Jews, Hindus, atheists, anybody who is concerned about this infringement of Islam and Islamism into our education and into our public policy and into our governments. They are free to join us. And so go to our website, claritycoalition.org, and read more about us, and and consider joining us.
All right. Well, thank you again, Yasmine. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Leslie.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.